Welcome to the Earth Feels podcast.
I'm Rose.
And I'm Christine.
Welcome to Earth Feels, the podcast for people feeling overwhelmed by the endlessly gloomy climate news.
Where every week we have soul-based conversations about climate change and explore the idea that climate change may be happening for us as much as it is happening to us.
If you are ready to shift your focus and secure the future for our kids and our grandkids, then this is the podcast for you.
And yes, we do know how to spell.
Hi, Christine.
Hi, Rose. How are you? I'm very excited to talk to the guest that you've lined up for us today.
Yeah, our question this week is, how do we cope with environmental grief? And I'm really excited to have Dr. Kriss Kevorkian, who is a self-billed deducator and thanatologist. Kriss's specialty is environmental grief, ecological grief. I know I've mentioned a number of times that as an empath, I feel this collective grief that's out there right now. I think we're in the middle of a great grieving. That's what came to me last night. There's many of us that are feeling this and may not know what it is we're feeling. I was connected with Kriss through Climate Reality, which Christine has also done. So lots of us out there, kudos to Al Gore for bringing us all together. Kriss, let's just say hello and talk about your background a little bit and how you came to coin this phrase, environmental grief. Because I think that was back in 2011 or something? You were really on the forefront of this.
Yeah, it was actually a little bit earlier. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this. And it's lovely meeting you again. I am grateful to Al Gore for connecting all of us. So I coined the term and conducted research on environmental grief back actually in 2001.
Wow.
And I was working on my doctorate in thanatology, which is the study or science of death, dying, and grief. I was asked to contribute something new to the field. I had originally studied whales pretty much since 7th grade on when I first went whale watching and struggled to stay on the boat instead of diving in to play with the gray whales. I ended up in death and dying sort of by a fluke, no pun intended though. My parents basically wanted me to become a lawyer just so I could support them as they got older, and that wasn't for me. So ended up getting into social work and took to that like a fish to water, especially working with the dying. I felt so privileged and so honored to be able to sit with people who are dying and learning from them, and I was getting paid to do that. So it was rather remarkable, but such a blessed time for me. And when they asked what I wanted to contribute, it kind of threw me because I was looking at communication at the end of life, because at the time when I was working as a hospice medical social worker, there were so many physicians who were struggling to communicate to their patients that they were dying. And so I would often find myself asked to go see a patient in their home to admit them to hospice services. And they would ask, "Why are you here? I'm not dying."
Wow.
And so I'd have to explain to them that the doctor sent us because he or she believes that you are. So that just sort of grew out of this need. I thought, okay, I need to help train medical professionals how to communicate. And so when this professor said, "We want you to contribute something new," I was throwing all these ideas at him, and he said, "Nope, nope, nope, nope." And I said, "Well, forget this." And so I looked back at all the whales that I had sort of left behind as I got in my death and dying journey, and got in touch with organizations like American Cetacean Society that I had volunteered with years ago when I was a kid, and just realized that things were not good at all for whales and the environment. And so as I was reading articles and looking at all these journals, I started feeling this immense grief and said, "Oh my God, I've got environmental grief." And so I looked it up and couldn't find it anywhere, mentioned it to my doctoral committee. They're like, "Well, yeah, you might be onto something, but just know that no one's going to feel this way but you."
Wow.
And you're never going to make money. You're never going to get anywhere with it. But as long as you're happy with it, it is something new, but it's just going to be your issue.
Interesting.
I thought, but if I have it, there could be one other person out there.
Maybe.
at the time, when I did share, people just looked at me funny. One woman I interviewed, and she thought, yeah, it would really be the challenge if I lost a brother or the environment. And then somebody talked with her about this afterwards, and they said, that's crazy. Why would you even want to participate in some sort of project like that? So she called me and wanted to cancel and get out of it. Focused my research on the decline of the southern resident orca here in Washington State, in the Salish Sea that's between Washington State and Canada. I interviewed people who are working with them, and it was pretty eye-opening because a lot of the people said that they had this vague feeling, but they could never put a name to it. And when I mentioned environmental grief, they're like, oh my God, that's exactly what it is. Mm-hmm. You put a name to something and now we can move forward. At the time, it was just people didn't really pay much attention to it. And most of my friends and family were just like, go back to hospice, get a job, do something else. It just wasn't for me, but it was challenging.
Isn't that always the way, though? When you're on the forefront of something, they call you crazy until they start believing it, right?
Yeah, but it was a little frustrating too, because even when I present at conferences, I presented at Oxford University at 2 conferences, and one was specifically for like conservation biologists and people in the hard sciences. And they had that same reaction as, wow, you put a name to something, we didn't know what it was, thank you. And the other conference was for people in the soft sciences, like sociology, anthropology, and psychology. And after I presented, I could have sworn there were just crickets. People just looked at me. There was no clapping. They looked at one another going, what is she talking about? And people literally asked, why would we grieve over the environment? So today, when people are coming out and we've got all these psychologists and others who are jumping on this, I'm just like, where were you a few years ago? You just ignored me and shamed me for what I came up with.
I think Christine can kind of relate to that. Why don't you tell her your story, Christine?
It's just interesting because I wasn't doing this in 2001. You're way ahead of me. But my background is in nursing and I do energy work. I was interested. I was on your website and I love that you have a link to Tapping with Brad. He's one of my favorite tappers as well. So I do that and I do other energy work. I'm also a used to be Reiki trained therapist, and I did therapeutic touch for years when I was a nurse on dialysis unit, which obviously has, death and dying comes up in that situation as well. In 2016, I presented at the ACEP conference, which is the Association for Comprehensive Energy Psychology, on climate trauma and tapping. It was a very small workshop. They didn't put me in the main hall, and I didn't have that many people come. There was maybe 15 of us, but I can tell you of the people that showed up, they were traumatized by this. So it's really important work that you're doing. And as Rose said, you were clearly like way ahead of the curve. It still felt, that was 4 years ago, pretty marginal in that setting.
I wonder how much it's changing now. I kind of wanted to reiterate the statement that I think people are feeling this. They don't know what it is. Because there is this, I live in the States, but there is this overwhelming sense of like doom. And I don't think it's just the election cycle. I think it is seeing the news about what's happening to our environment and really kind of still turning away from it. But in turning away from it, we're just in this denial. It's still happening. We're still feeling it. We're still energetically feeling it. And if we look at, for me, I believe, and I'm not schooled in this, but I believe that this is why we're seeing a rise in addictions, whether it's just addiction to distraction or addiction to opiates or whatever. People are in great grief, but they don't know why.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And Christine, that's really interesting, your experience, because one would think within that community of energy workers that they would be a little bit more connected, and seeing that as, wow, let's get involved in this. I know for me, because I do a lot of energy work, and as Rose was saying, I too am an empath and a light worker, and it just is surprising to me how I run into people who are very connected to whales and dolphins on a spiritual level. And so I ask them about, so what are you doing to save them? And there seems to be this disconnection. Perhaps they know something more that I don't, but I keep thinking there's something we still need to do. And I love that there are some really great spiritual teachers out there who are making the connection between the fact that there are those who don't get involved in any sort of movement per se, but they are getting acknowledged now, and held in the light of, yeah, we are doing something. We're making strides to save our planet. Mother Nature is fine. The planet actually will be all right. But just watching all her inhabitants die, our wild cousins, is overwhelming. And Rose, I agree, that's very interesting. And I think actually quite spot on about all the addictions going on and everything. I'm concerned about a mass suicide. We see it among the animal population with whales beaching. And a lot of people suggest that, they're taken off. Their world is being destroyed with pollutants, plastics, and everything else we're throwing in the oceans. And so they're taking off.
They've just had it. I was on your website as well. Just wanted to say how impressed I was that Ram Dass was on your website. That's amazing. And you must be familiar with Thich Nhat Hanh's approach, what he said about climate change, which is that only love will save us from climate change.
Yeah. And I love these teachers. And Ram Dass, it was so funny because I was just throwing out names. And because of the program I went through, I was able to ask people from all over the world who were experts in death and dying to be on my committee, whereas oftentimes you're stuck within the program that you're in to ask professors and others. So I was just throwing names out, and I thought, gee, I wonder if Ram Dass would be on my committee. And I have this feeling, just send it out. There's, just ask if you have nothing to lose.
Mm-hmm.
And it was so fascinating that I had asked people who, in my opinion, were not as well known as he and others. And they really just blew me off harshly. And he was so kind. I'm like, okay, I got the right person here. This is somebody just full of love. And I'm so sorry he's gone. But oh my God, what an impact, lasting impact he's made.
Mm-hmm.
But Rose, too, what you were saying, just the great grieving that I hear within the spiritual community that we're moving to a new earth, and there is a lot of upheaval. And what's so fascinating about this time is that it is happening on all levels. I mean, astrologically, energetically, politically, everything is happening now.
Economically.
Economically, it's a perfect storm. And so let's see what comes out of it. And
racially, spiritually, ethnically, everything is changing. Everything is changing. Going back to the grief part of it, I think at the core of that is knowing that we're responsible. It's one thing to see all the dying around you, even if it's unconscious, but it's another thing to know that we are responsible for it. I think that's devastating to the human psyche.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that's, I think, one of the hardest parts because it's acknowledging and accepting that. And people just don't want to do that. So they'll continue to go about their days as business as usual and just kind of put out what's really happening. They just don't want to deal with it. It's a denial.
We're having to deal with it now because we're seeing the repercussions of.
We are, but it's still amazing to me how many people really just don't want to accept it.
No, they want to go back to where we were.
Yeah, but even as we're dealing with masks in my community, the elected leaders are like, yeah, it should be a personal decision. We shouldn't regulate. And I just keep thinking, then you regulate seatbelts, but somebody not wearing a mask could kill me or others. It just makes no sense. And I'm hoping that through all this, that people will finally wake up. And it sounds as though people are going to. We just have to be patient and hold people up.
Till we get to that tipping point. I do feel like there's a possibility. I'm feeling encouraged, and I was saying this to Christine before we got on this call. I do feel a sense of hope. It was a small glimmer. It feels bigger. It feels like it's growing. Now, maybe that's related to what's happening in 17 days from now. But
I want to talk to you on November 4th, my dear.
Okay. Yep.
I hope.
I'll be hungover one way or the other, either from celebrating or drowning my despair, one or the other.
Can I just pick up on something that Kriss said about how we need to be patient, that people are changing and waking up? And I think that's a conundrum. It's a struggle if you're a climate activist because you are aware that the science is pretty urgent. The scientists have been ringing the alarm for decades now. They have told us we have now, is it 8 years? And so just to point out that I agree with everything that both of you have said about this is a big shift and, hang on, it's coming. But there's also part of me that goes, well, it better not take too long.
Yeah. So Kriss, to get back to our question, how do we cope with our environmental grief? Well, actually, first of all, I wanted to ask you, there's two separate terms that you've coined. Environmental grief and ecological grief. Those are two separate things. Is that correct?
Yeah, because environmental grief is the grief reaction stemming from the environmental loss of ecosystems caused by natural or man-made events. And then ecological grief is a grief reaction stemming from the disconnection and our relational loss from our natural world. So to me, that relates more to my surroundings, my connection with my brother, sister, trees, my wild cousins that I am with on a daily basis or near me. Some people relate that more to the southern resident orcas that they're so connected to. Mm-hmm. With environmental grief, looking at ecosystems, species. So losing an entire forest, losing an entire species is more of environmental grief.
So do you think that more people are feeling the environmental grief because it's more widespread versus the ecological grief? If you live in the city and you've never really been connected with wildlife, then you might not be experiencing that on a personal level.
Well, I think you still could, because I'm originally from Los Angeles and I now live in Gig Harbor, Washington. And even in Los Angeles, we had deer and coyotes and other critters. And what I would experience there is we had a couple red-tailed hawks, and when I wouldn't see them for a while, I'd feel very concerned, like what's going on, what happened to them. Mm-hmm. And now where I live in Gig Harbor, I'm struggling because since the fires, for the smoke from all the fires, I haven't seen any of my birds or my chipmunks or squirrels. And I'm sorry, I should not say but I relate to them as family.
Right.
And so I'm very concerned, and I don't know where my deer are. I know I've seen a few of my coyotes around, so they might keep the other cousins away, but it's a huge struggle for me. It's a huge concern because I see where I live as I am the caretaker here. I am the caregiver and caretaker. So this area where in our Western world gives me a piece of paper saying I own this spot. I don't own it. I caretake the spot for all the other inhabitants who are here with me.
Nice.
And so it's just my concern of where are my brothers and sisters and my cousins.
That sort of makes the point that it's ongoing.
Yes.
The ecological grief. It's not just that you feel it and then deal with it and move on. And that's why we decided how to cope with it as opposed to dispel it or get rid of it.
Getting back to the question about how to cope with environmental grief, I think one of the biggest things is acknowledging that you have it and honoring yourself for that. Because I think it takes people who are rather sensitive to be able to actually feel that. And since it's a bit challenging because there are others who don't feel it, really take the time to honor yourself for that. And I tell people to honor yourself, feel the grief, go through your grieving process, whatever that is for you. People aren't, unfortunately, taught how to grieve in school. We kind of pick it up as we get older. Yeah, and we'll see what adults do when we're kids, how they respond. And hopefully those adults will be grieving in a healthy fashion. Oftentimes it may not be, again, because no one really knows how to do it. No one's taught them. So we pick it up, and what I do is I try and reinforce healthy coping skills. So I'll ask people, how have you coped in the past? And then build on whatever strengths we can find and then move forward. Because grief is unique to each person just because of the skills that we do pick up as we get older. So acknowledging it and then using it to take action. And the example I use for that is Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. They were able to organize, they used their grief to do that and change policy. Mm-hmm. And so I look at harnessing my grief and using it to, my work is with rights of nature, making sure that nature has the rights of personhood, like corporations and ships do in the United States. Nature should have a seat at the table when policies are being made, when anything is being made. We rely on her to exist. And by excluding her is, when you think about it, it's just ridiculous. It's like excluding the medical profession. It's excluding science. Sadly, in the US, we're seeing a lot of people wanting to do that. And yet when they get sick, they still go to the doctor. It's just kind of crazy. But acknowledging it, finding support, whether it's with friends, community, I find that to be really helpful. And especially since I didn't have that. To me, that's key. When I meet people like you two and others, it's like, oh, thank God. I find people who get it, because you get to that point. I honestly was thinking, what's wrong with me? Why am I the only one feeling this? How could this be possible? So it's nice to know that you're not alone. But again, Christine, sort of to respond to something you said a little bit ago, was the patience that we have. It's challenging as an environmentalist to go about your day or doing what you can to protect the environment and lessen your carbon footprint, and then be surrounded by people who just don't care. People wearing masks that, thank you for wearing a mask, but it's the disposable one and you're dropping it when you get out of the grocery store. You can't even be bothered to throw it in a trash bin. That gets old so fast. But I think with everything, that unless it affects you personally, people just don't seem to get it. We could tell people to quit smoking because it causes cancer, and it's secondhand smoke causes lung cancer as well, but they won't care until it affects them.
Although that's a really good example, because attitudes have shifted.
Yes, but then we still have the fact that even in my community here in Washington, which people think is green, and with all the smoke that we had to deal with here, our city council still doesn't really seem to care about climate change. They're not acknowledging it. So it's taking a while, but I think nature is showing us she's shaking things up so much to ignore this anymore. And those who do are going to be left behind, unfortunately. I think they are going to be the minority, probably within the next year.
May it be so.
Yes.
May it be so.
Yeah.
Well, I command that now. Let it, let's command that. Let's demand that. It is so.
I sort of identify with the climate trauma, because in 2009, when I sort of my shift from being a climate change avoider, which is what I called it, because it was such a big issue. And what can one person do, about it? And it was just too scary. In fact, I never even watched An Inconvenient Truth because it was too scary. And I knew it would affect my daughters. And so I have compassion for people who feel that way, because I was one of them. And then I had my awakening. I had a blog about climate change, and I blogged every day for 5 years. And I can tell you, I was traumatized after that. I was so overwhelmed. And I was also very active and, meeting with politicians and doing public presentations and everything. But I was traumatized. And so that's what got me reconnected to my energy work, which I hadn't been doing as much in that last decade. I got trained in therapeutic touch back in, 1992. I really feel like self-care is so important. I don't know if you want to talk a bit about the energy healing that you do. Is that part of your tool for coping with environmental grief? Or
Yeah, but I really appreciate what you were sharing, though, too, because I'm grateful to my hospice work, because that's where I got to learn about Reiki. And I worked in one hospice that had just about every alternative therapy you can imagine: sound therapy, even animal-assisted therapy, vibrational therapy, music thanatology, healing touch, Reiki, everything, acupuncture, everything, even EFT. And it was just wonderful to see. Aromatherapy was so huge. I love aromatherapy. It's amazing how it can help people. But I think, I just want to get back to the patience thing, though, again, because I think that's really a struggle for so many of us. And that adds to our grief. It adds to our frustration and anxiety. But I think we just really have to be patient, because not everybody's going to wake up at the same time. Like you had a journey, Christine, to go through to get to that point. And then that brought you back to your energy work. And then look at how much you've been able to help people through that. So I think just being able to be as patient as we can, recognizing that thankfully we're not all the same, because life would be very boring if we were. But we need to be supportive of our brothers and sisters and hope that they're going to catch on sooner than later, because we all have to at one point, or not. It depends on our trajectory and what people want to believe in.
So you're saying holding the space.
Exactly.
Putting out the information that you can, and just holding the space for people to step into, and being unattached to how quickly, or even if they ever.
And that is a spiritual discipline.
It is. Yeah.
It is. And it's a challenge. But I think I learned years ago by a therapist colleague of mine who used to say, expectations are resentments under construction. And I think it's perfect. I think it's really perfect. I think
true.
it's, we have our own journey and we get to meet incredible people along the way who are our teachers, who we'll learn from, who we will teach. And that is what we're here to do. And I learned that from my hospice work.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just being respectful of where people are, no matter how frustrated we may be with them. I love people who can actually show compassion to our political leaders. I'm not there yet, but they are.
Yeah.
And I look at my friends in awe and think, wow, you guys are really doing great work. Hopefully one day I will be there. But in the meantime, it's like, come on, people, get it, because we're destroying our planet. Species are going.
Yeah.
I'm grieving. Do something.
Yeah.
But the more we push and resist, the more we're resisting all the good that could come as well. There's the energy flow, as you both know.
Yeah.
We cannot say resist, 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 and then not get all the good stuff. So I think we just have to be conscious of everything we say and do and trust. We could have had this discussion a few months ago and I would not be saying this. I would have said other things like, oh my God, we're all gonna, what are we doing?
So what has shifted for you in the last couple of months?
I think just really trusting in Mother Nature.
Yeah.
And all that she is doing, because she knows best. And it's just sad that we haven't learned that. We don't seem to learn from history as much as I think that we should. It's just really learning from her and trusting her and all her inhabitants, because they teach us valuable lessons.
In the context of the fire and coronavirus, or was there other?
I think with everything, just because it's a struggle when Rose was saying that, this is all human made, we're doing this to ourselves. To have had my experience in hospice when there was one patient in particular who had the electrical transformer in her front yard, and physicians didn't understand why she was dying. They just kept saying, well, maybe she's hysterical or something, but she shouldn't be dying. Listen to that language. She shouldn't be dying. None of the physicians ever went to her home to see this transformer in their front yard. I remember driving up and I could hear this buzzing. Mm-hmm. And by the time I got to the home, it was just like, oh my God. I got out of my car and my whole body was reacting to this. And even in the house, I was reacting to the buzzing of the transformer. Mm-hmm. And I thought, there's no way somebody could live here and not be affected by that. But because the doctors never saw it, or never, and who would think to ask, hey, is there a transformer in your front yard? They just sort of wrote her off and dismissed her and the symptoms she had. She still died, but it just being aware of what we're doing to ourselves, instead of thinking, oh yeah, it's okay to have these power plants next to elementary schools. Kids are resilient, they'll be fine. All of these things that we're doing, we all know this is killing us. The wealthy people are able to say, well, not in my backyard. The underserved people, the marginalized populations aren't able to do that. And so I think they are waking up more. I think we're seeing a surge of the disenfranchised waking up and saying enough.
Definitely people are finding their voice in the last 6 months, whether it's because of climate with Greta Thunberg coming in, or that's probably within the last year, or all the racial things that are happening here in the United States. People are finding their voice and they're realizing that it's going to take a crescendo of voices to change the status quo. But people are caring enough and becoming engaged. Christine and I started this. We cared about the world that we were leaving for our kids and our unborn grandchildren. And I think you're seeing a lot of elders come out for the vote right now because they're concerned about the future that they're leaving behind. If we can couple that with young people who come in almost seeing the devastation, they seem to understand it on an energetic level that us oldsters didn't get to till later on.
Yeah, but even what you said, and you said it beautifully, thank you. Even with some of the older people, they're still not getting it because they don't see that it's going to affect them or their children. Because in my community, I'm still shocked at how many people are supportive of a political party that is just not supportive of others who are different. I wonder, and I ask them, how is it that you could feel this way? And I was like, well, we're fine. They have money. They don't need to worry about anything.
Yeah.
All the money in the world isn't going to stop your house from being burned down. Your children could still get illnesses. It's a sad way that people are looking. But again, if it doesn't affect them, they just don't seem to care. But getting back to coping, some other strategies that I recommend are mindfulness. I find mindfulness being really helpful. Focusing on the present, focusing on what is right in front of you. As you mentioned before, Christine, about people are in the city, how do they manage this? I'd say even if you've got a plant in your home, connect with that plant, connect with something living. I think that helps people. I've shared when I had my dog and he left me last year, he would remind me, he was just the best reminder of living in the moment, being present, because it was all about him. It was his world and I was living in it. Clearly, that was how our relationship was. He was wonderful. He was a little boy and he said, it's all about me, Mom, you're home. Now it's about me and pay attention to me. And it was perfect because I could have had the worst day ever. And he filled me with joy and bliss. And he was a little angel saying, let's live now. Because I hear a lot of climate leaders saying, we're all going to die. And I'm just like, well, yeah, you're born, you live, you die, that happens. But we get to choose how we want to live. And if you want to live that way, then it's up to you. But I prefer to live in the now, being grateful for everything and everyone who is around me and doing my best to help secure their lives and their futures.
There's definitely a sense of, for me, it's a sense of gratitude. I was also sharing with Christine, I had gone out to the Berkshires this weekend. In New England is, leaf peeping time right now. And the colors were so extraordinary, just so extraordinary that they literally take your breath away. And if you can stay mindful in that beauty, I was able to, over 3 or 4 days, just fill my heart and fill my whole being with that beauty, gratitude for that beauty, for Mother Earth giving us that beauty. I'm hopeful that I can hold on to that for long enough to get me through the November 3rd. Was saying to myself, consciously saying to myself, remember this feeling, so that I could go back to that feeling or incorporate that feeling when I'm anxious about what's going on.
Yeah, beautiful. That's exactly what I hope people can do, is remember those times and feel that again, because that's what's so important. We have to continue to feel that energy, and that will lift us up and help us to move forward. So that's a beautiful example. Thank you, Rose.
Probably need to wrap up. We have a 3-step process to close where we talk about some good news. Our good news for this week is mayors of 12 cities representing 36 million people have announced plans to divest from fossil fuels. This is all around the world. It's Berlin, Cape Town, London, LA, Bristol, UK, Durban, Milan, New Orleans, New York City, Pittsburgh, Vancouver, Oslo. Mayors of 12 cities representing 36 million residents have announced plans to divest. So it is getting towards that tipping point, right? Getting towards that tipping point. And then we usually also have a sanity tip and an action step.
And I think Kriss has given us pretty clear sanity tips.
So being mindful and then also journaling really help. If I can also leave with some good news.
Sure.
Yes.
So I'm founder of the Legal Rights for the Salish Sea, and we're focusing on getting rights of nature for the southern resident orca, as I mentioned. We're actually making some strides there. We have a couple of elected officials, some legislators who are interested in perhaps introducing a bill for rights of nature for the southern residents next year. It's a little tough because of COVID and everything that's happening because there's so many other issues, but the rights of nature movement is growing around the world. So if people are interested in that, I'd really encourage them to get involved because, again, that's a beautiful community to be a part of, really connecting with nature and seeing her as family that we need to help live with rather than fight against. Our website is legalrightsforthesalishsea.org. We've got a declaration to send to our governor and officials in Canada. If people would like to sign on, it's on that website.
That's a great action step.
I'm remaining hopeful, and I am so grateful to the two of you for offering this podcast and for doing what you two are doing. So thank you.
Thanks for being here, Kriss. We really appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
That's this week's episode of Earth Feels. Special thanks to singer-songwriter Kristen Hoffman for generously allowing us to use Song for the Ocean. Thanks for listening.
Don't forget, subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss an episode. Catch you next time.
Bye-bye.
Children of the earth, I'm calling out. There's a mission for you and for me.